Section 7. The Bible and Certainty. The terrible text. Beloved, being very eager to write to you of our common salvation, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. Jude chapter 1, verse 3. No one comes to the Father but by me. John chapter 14, verse 6. He who is not with me is against me. Matthew chapter 12, verse 30. Chapter 25. The symptoms: conversion, missionary expansion, and religious bigotry. A spirituality revolution is taking place in Western and Eastern societies as politics fails as a vessel of hope and meaning. This revolution is not to be confused with the rising tide of religious fundamentalism, although the two are caught up in the same phenomenon: the emergence of the sacred as a leading force in contemporary society. Spirituality and fundamentalism are at opposite ends of the cultural spectrum. Spirituality seeks a sensitive, contemplative, transformative relationship with the sacred and is able to sustain levels of uncertainty in its quest because respect for mystery is paramount. Fundamentalism seeks certainty, fixed answers, and absolutism as a fearful response to the complexity of the world and to our vulnerability as creatures in a mysterious universe. Spirituality arises from love of and intimacy with the sacred, and fundamentalism arises from fear of and possession of the sacred. The choice between spirituality and fundamentalism is a choice between conscious intimacy and unconscious possession. David Tacey. There is an Episcopal congregation named St. Francis in the Fields, located in a fashionable suburb of Louisville, Kentucky, called Harrod's Creek, that seems to have a hard time with the concepts of diversity and even freedom of speech. Some members of this congregation discovered, I gathered to their horror, that a study group in their congregation was actually reading books that appeared to challenge what some of them called the true faith of the church. The clergy leadership of this congregation dispatched one of its own to meet with the members of that study group. This meeting confirmed their worst suspicions. This group had actually been reading books by Marcus Borg, Elaine Pagels, Rowan Williams, and Karen Armstrong. That was an interesting list. Marcus Borg is a well-published Jesus scholar who teaches at Oregon State University. He is married to an Episcopal priest and is himself an active Episcopal layperson. Elaine Pagels is a professor of religion at Princeton University whose books are regularly on the New York Times bestseller list. She is much involved in her Episcopal congregation as a regular worshiper. Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is liberal on social issues but conservative on theological issues. Karen Armstrong, a former Roman Catholic nun, is probably the best-known religious writer in the world today. Undeterred by these credentials, the priest issued an ultimatum to this group saying, in effect, from now on, you must read only the books which we, the clergy of this church, assign and approve. He then suggested a list of acceptable authors, all well-known traditional and, I might add, rather boring writers who would be thought of primarily as Christian propagandists rather than as Christian scholars. The list included names of those with encyclopedic but not necessarily original minds. Furthermore, this priest stated that if the members of this group wanted to continue meeting in that particular church, they must be monitored regularly, perhaps even led by one of the church's clergy. If they were not willing to follow this directive, said this holy man from the office of the heavenly sheriff, they would have to leave the church. The creeds of the church, he asserted, cannot be debated since they represent the faith that has been once and for all delivered to the saints. Perhaps this priest was not aware that the historic creeds of the church were developed in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Christian era, and that far from falling from heaven in 3 neatly organized Trinitarian paragraphs, complete with punctuation, they were adopted amid ruckus debate, with all of the wheeling and dealing, the compromises and power plays that accompany every decision-making convention, whether it is primarily political or ecclesiastical. I still have a difficult time believing that this scenario actually happened in my denomination, and as recently as the first decade of the 21st century. Was not the Episcopal Church part of the Anglican Communion that bounded into existence as the result of Henry VIII's sex life and multiple wives? Do they not still define themselves as the great via media, standing between the Catholic tradition and Protestant principle? But happen it did. I have actually read the correspondence between this priest, the members of the study group, and the congregation. What amazed me most was the implication conveyed by the clergy of this church, who appear to define themselves primarily as the defenders of the faith, that the Christian faith can be and has been reduced to a set of propositional statements delivered to human beings by divine revelation. Perhaps it was even more incredible to me that they assumed that their finite human minds could define the reality of God, and that their definition was ever afterward not to be subject to debate or change. That assumption was breathtaking in its naviate. To bring this episode to its actual conclusion, the offending study group, I understand, accepted the invitation not to be monitored or led, but to leave that church. They moved their meeting place and perhaps their membership to nearby St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. Perhaps there they will be able to continue their journey into the mystery of God, unimpeded by benefit of clergy. I wish I could assume that this rather bizarre tale was only an isolated event, triggered by an insecurity so deep as to be pitiable in the mind of one, or at least a very few, of the church's clergy. But that would be to turn a blind eye to Christian history. This behavior might seem rare and warped in our enlightened day, but the attitude behind it has dotted the landscape of the Christian tradition during the majority of its 2,000 plus years of life. Religious closed-minded ignorance wrapped in bigotry has even been justified by appeals to the sacred scriptures, which have again and again been quoted to demonstrate that if one disagrees with the stated faith of the church, one is actually disagreeing with God and God's truth. When one adds to this the claim that the scriptures are themselves the very word of God, the circular argument becomes apparent and seemingly defensible. The particular verse in the Bible that these Louisville clergy appear to have had in mind, and certainly the verse that has been frequently quoted to justify religious intolerance, is located in an obscure and seldom read book in the New Testament called the Epistle of Jude. In that very brief, one-chapter-long book, a reference is made in the third verse to something the author calls the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. Most people would not be able to locate this epistle in the Bible if their lives depended on it. Consisting of only 25 verses, it nestles between the third epistle of John and the book of Revelation, which makes it the next to the last book in the New Testament. It is part of a group of writings that scholars designate as general epistles. I have never heard any verse of this epistle quoted in any context save for this one. The implication present in this isolated text, and certainly the conclusion intended by those who quote it, is that Christianity can be and has been captured in a series of creeds, doctrines, and dogmas, the truth of which is both self-evident and unchanging. Anyone who dares to question this conclusion or these core beliefs is questioning nothing less than God. Once those implications are accepted, it certainly becomes the duty of the church and its hierarchy to protect all the other people of the world from such heresy. Whenever truth becomes set, it is inevitable that every new idea and even every new perspective becomes threatening and disturbing to the stated truth, and thus it becomes an enemy to be suppressed. That clearly was the mentality underlying the behavior of the ordained persons in this Kentucky congregation, as they sought to justify both their ignorance and their arrogance in the claim that their actions possess biblical authority and biblical respectability. When threatened, religious people have a compelling need to command conformity for their own faith assertions, or to put down any challenge to the traditions of their religious past. The idea that there is such a thing as the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints is a godsend. It is used like a rapier's thrust in defense of orthodoxy. It suppresses all lack of certainty. It leads the charge against any deviation. This produces the religious mentality that causes a variety of religious bodies to claim that they and they alone are the true church. This is the source out of which the assertions come that our Pope is infallible or our Bible is inerrant. When certainty combines with zeal in religious matters, horror always results. Jude's suggestion that we must contend for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints has thus been the source of enormous pain and horror, as any quick look at history will reveal. The fact that this attitude is still alive and well in Kentucky in the 21st century is a cause for great alarm. This text from Jude supports the claim so frequently made by Christians that there is only one way to believe, and that, of course, is the way of the one who quotes this text. This pious claim thus gives to the religious arrogance the mask of respectability. To the Grand Inquisitor, it gives the face of a holy man. This is the mentality that provides the rationale by which destructive conversion tactics and aggressive, imperialistic missionary activities have been countenanced. For it is not obvious that once God has been captured in some kind of credo box, once the Christian faith has been reduced to a set of propositional statements, doctrines, and dogmas, then an idolatry of killing proportions becomes operative in religious life. This is why, even in the 21st century, religion remains one of the most divisive and hostile forces in the world. Embarrassing as it may be to those of us who call ourselves Christians, the fact is that more people have been killed in the history of the world in conflicts over and about religion than over any other single factor. Religion has so often been the source of the cruelest evil. Its darkest and most brutal side becomes visible at the moment when the adherents of any religious system identify their understanding of God with God. The two are never the same. This misguided conviction then gives rise to the idea that it is a religious duty to preserve God's truth from any challenge, from any source. Only with this kind of assumption would an Episcopal priest in Louisville, Kentucky, in the 1st century, think it appropriate and even essential to tell a group of church members what books they may and may not read, or to insist that anyone who might stray outside some clearly defined box must be monitored by the clergy. People who see themselves as defenders of the faith argue that without certainty, Christianity will not survive. They point to the fact that churches with fuzzy, liberal messages are dying, and that churches with firm and unbending beliefs are growing. There is a germ of anecdotal truth in those claims, but holding fast to firm truth can be managed only if truth is narrowed to include just the data with which that believer is comfortable. My contention, which I will seek to defend in this section of the book, is that the moment any religious tradition claims certainty, it turns demonic. It also gives up at that moment the very reason for which it was originally created. Whether such a tradition lives or dies, therefore, becomes of little significance. Above all, I contend that something called the faith of the church has never existed. Truth, whether it be religious truth or any other kind, is always evolving and changing, and the moment truth is codified, it begins to die. That makes it very difficult to be triumphal and certain. We Christians are pilgrims walking into the mystery of God, not soldiers marching off to war. There is a great difference.